There is a single man in the entire Bible who receives the title of God's anointed, and it is not David, it is not Solomon, it is no prophet, no priest, no king of Israel. It is a pagan warrior who never set foot in Jerusalem, never read a line of the Torah, and who worshipped a god of fire. His name was Cyrus, and the prophet Isaiah, writing more than 100 years before this man was born, recorded something that to this day disturbs theologians the world over. Isaiah 45, verse 1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. The word in the original Hebrew is Mashiach, Messiah, the same title that would be given to Jesus Christ centuries later. God looked at a Persian king, a man who did not know him, and said, "This is my anointed." How is this possible? And why did the nation that saved God's people from extinction become thousands of years later one of the most feared names in the modern world? The answer is buried in layers of history that date back to the dawn of human civilization. And it all begins in a place that the Bible mentions even before speaking of Abraham. Before Persia existed, before Iran existed, there was Elam. And Elam is so ancient that it appears in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, the list that describes how humanity spread after the flood. The text says that Elam was the son of Shem, one of the 3 sons of Noah. This means that, according to the biblical narrative, the Elamites were Semites, distant cousins of the Hebrews, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. And this genealogical connection is no minor detail. It explains why this land appears so many times in biblical history, intertwined with the destiny of Israel in ways that most people never realize. Now, imagine this region 5,000 years ago. What is today southwestern Iran was a fertile valley squeezed between the Zagros Mountains to the north and the plains of Mesopotamia to the west. The capital was called Susa, and yes, it is the same Susa that appears in the Book of Esther and the Book of Daniel. Archaeological excavations carried out starting in 1884 by the Frenchman Marcel Dieulafoy revealed that Susa was already a functional city around 4000 BC. We are talking about a city that already existed when the Sumerians were still inventing writing. When the pyramids of Giza began to be erected, Susa already had more than 1,000 years of history. And Elam was not a passive people. Genesis 14 records something extraordinary. A coalition of 4 kings from the east invaded the Dead Sea region and defeated 5 local kings. The leader of this coalition? Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. He descended with his armies, crushed Sodom and Gomorrah, took captives and plunder, and among the captives was Lot, Abraham's nephew. This is one of the oldest military events recorded in the Bible, and the commander was an Elamite, a general who came out of what is now Iran and attacked what is now Israel. Abraham had to mount a rescue operation with 318 trained men to recover his nephew. Think of the absurdity of that. 318 men against an army that had just defeated 5 cities, and he succeeded. But the point here is not Abraham. It is the power of Elam. Even back then, the territory that would become Persia projected military force over the entire Middle East. If you are impressed by the fact that the Bible mentions Iran from the very first chapters of Genesis, leave a like on this video now so it can reach more people who need to know this story. But here enters something that completely transforms this story. Elam was powerful, but it was not the people who would change the destiny of Israel. That role fell to a group of nomadic tribes who lived scattered through the Zagros Mountains, herding goats and horses at altitudes where the air is so thin that the lungs burn. The Greeks called them the Medes. And to the south of them, in the hotter plains, lived another related group, the Parsua, the Persians. For centuries, these two peoples lived in the shadow of the great empires, first under Elam, then under Assyria, then under Babylon. They were vassals, they paid tribute, They had no voice. No one looked at those mountains and imagined that from there would emerge the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Medes organized first. Around 678 BC, a leader named Deioces unified the Median tribes and built a capital, Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan in Iran. The Greek historian Herodotus describes Ecbatana as a city with 7 concentric walls, each higher than the last, each painted a different color. The outermost wall was white, the next black, then red, blue, orange. The 6th was plated with silver, and the 7th, the wall surrounding the royal palace, was covered in pure gold. There may be poetic exaggeration here, but excavations have confirmed that Ecbatana was real and it was monumental. And it was in the mountains of Media that biblical prophecy began to move like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. The prophet Isaiah, writing around 700 BC, had already announced something specific. He didn't just say that Babylon would fall, he said who would bring it down. Isaiah 13 verse 17, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them." Isaiah wrote this when Babylon had not even reached its peak. Nebuchadnezzar had not even been born. The Neo-Babylonian Empire did not even exist yet, and Isaiah was already naming its destroyer. But the most disturbing detail comes in Isaiah 44 and 45, when God goes further and names not just the people, but the individual, Cyrus, a man who would be born more than a century later. Cyrus II was born around 600 BC, the son of Cambyses I, a minor king of the region of Anshan, a small Persian kingdom vassal to the Medes. Persia at that time was what you would call today a satellite state. It existed, but it didn't rule anything. Cyrus's maternal grandfather was Astyages, king of the Medes, which meant that Cyrus had royal Median and Persian blood at the same time. And this double lineage would be the key to everything. Herodotus tells a story that probably mixes fact with legend, but which reveals how the ancients perceived Cyrus. According to the account, Astyages had a dream in which his daughter produced a vine that covered all of Asia. The Magi, the Zoroastrian priests who interpreted dreams, were terrified. They said that Astyages' grandson would dethrone him. Astyages ordered the baby to be killed, but the general charged with the task did not have a heart. He delivered the child to a shepherd in the mountains, and Cyrus grew up among shepherds without knowing who he was. Does that sound familiar? A future liberator raised in anonymity, hidden from the king who wanted to kill him. The pattern repeats in Moses, it repeats in Jesus, and here it repeats in Cyrus. It is as if biblical history had a mold for its instruments of salvation. When Cyrus grew up and discovered his true identity, he did exactly what the Magi predicted. In 550 BC, he led a rebellion against his own grandfather. The Median army split. Many soldiers deserted to Cyrus's side. Astyages was captured, and in a single stroke, Cyrus united Medes and Persians under one crown. But he did not humiliate the Medes. He did not enslave them. He did not massacre them. He treated Astyages with respect and incorporated the Median nobility into his government. This detail is fundamental because it reveals the type of conqueror Cyrus was and explains why God chose him. With Media conquered, Cyrus controlled a territory that went from eastern Turkey to Afghanistan. But that was still not enough. There were 2 obstacles between him and total dominance of the known world. The kingdom of Lydia to the west, ruled by the legendary Croesus, the richest man in the ancient world, and Babylon to the south, the most powerful city on earth. Cyrus attacked Lydia first. In 546 BC, he crossed the Halys River, which was the natural border between the 2 kingdoms. Croesus had consulted the Oracle of Delphi before the war and received the famous answer, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus understood that he would destroy Cyrus's empire. He was wrong. The great empire destroyed was his own. The Battle of Thymbra was decisive. Herodotus says that Cyrus used camels on the front line, not because camels were good in combat, but because the horses of the Lydian cavalry were terrified of the smell of camels. The horses reared, the riders fell, and the Lydian line collapsed. Croesus was captured alive, and once again Cyrus did not execute the defeated king. He spared his life and kept him as an advisor. Every victory of Cyrus followed the same pattern: conquest without cruelty, power without sadism. And this pattern was not accidental. It was the hallmark of the man Isaiah called the Anointed. Now only Babylon remained. And here history gains a dimension that gives chills, because inside those colossal walls 85 feet high and so wide that a chariot with 4 horses could drive on top, lived thousands of Jews, the descendants of the captives that Nebuchadnezzar had torn from Jerusalem 60 years earlier. They lived on the banks of the Babylonian canals, and Psalm 137 records their pain in words that cut to this day. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. 60 years. An entire generation was born and died in exile. The elders still remembered the temple in flames. The younger ones knew Jerusalem only through their grandparents' stories. And now, on the other side of those impossible walls, the Persian army was approaching. The Babylon of 539 BC was ruled by Nabonidus, an unpopular king who spent years away from the capital studying archaeology and worshipping the moon god Sin instead of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. His son Belshazzar ruled as regent, and here enters Daniel chapter 5, one of the most cinematic scenes in the entire Bible. Belshazzar organized a banquet for 1,000 nobles, not just any dinner, a spectacle of deliberate arrogance. He ordered the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought. Sacred vessels dedicated to the God of Israel, now being used as wine cups in a pagan feast. The nobles drank, laughed, and toasted to the gods of gold and silver. And then, at the height of the party, something happened that silenced 1,000 people at once. A hand appeared, not an angel, not a vision, a human hand, without a body, writing on the palace wall in the light of the candelabras. The text says that Belshazzar's face changed color. His knees knocked together. He trembled so much he could barely speak. On the wall, 4 words in Aramaic: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. No Babylonian wise man could decipher it. They called Daniel, now an elderly man deported from Jerusalem as a youth who had served under Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel looked at the words and delivered the sentence without hesitation. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, Daniel is direct and brutal. That very night, Belshazzar was killed. But how did Cyrus enter Babylon? The walls were impenetrable. No army in history had managed to invade them by force. The answer is so ingenious it seems like fiction. Herodotus and the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document discovered in 1879 that is considered the first declaration of human rights in history, tell complementary versions. Cyrus did not attack the walls, he attacked the river. The Euphrates ran through the city, entering through a gate under the north wall and exiting through another to the south. Cyrus ordered his engineers to divert the course of the river to an artificial lake upstream. The water level dropped, and in the dead of night, while Belshazzar feasted and the guards were drunk, Persian soldiers entered through the river passage with the water at waist height and took the city without a battle. Isaiah had prophesied this as well. Isaiah 44, verse 27, who says to the deep, "Be dry, and I will dry up your rivers." And in the following verse, he names Cyrus as the executor. The precision is disturbing. A prophet writing 150 years before described not only who would conquer Babylon, but how. If the precision of these prophecies impresses you, comment, "God is sovereign." Now think about what happened next, because it is here that the history of Iran and the history of Israel collide in a way that changed the world forever. In 538 BC, less than a year after taking Babylon, Cyrus issued a decree. The text is preserved in Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of the Lord." Read that again. A Persian king, Zoroastrian, a worshipper of Ahura Mazda, recognizing the God of Israel as the God of heaven and ordering the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He did not just free the Jews, he returned the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted. He financed the return trip. He paid for the reconstruction with money from the Persian royal treasury. Ezra 1:7 says that 5,400 gold and silver utensils were returned, 5,400 sacred objects crossing the desert back to Jerusalem, escorted by Persian soldiers. About 42,360 Jews made the journey back. Ezra records the exact number. After 70 years of exile, exactly 70 as Jeremiah had prophesied in Jeremiah 25, God's people were returning home. And the instrument of this liberation was not an angel, was not an earthquake, was not a plague. It was a Persian emperor, a man whom God himself called my anointed and my shepherd in Isaiah 44:28. The same word, ro, shepherd, that God used for David. This should stop anyone who thinks they understand how God operates. He did not use a prophet. He did not use a priest. He used a foreign king who worshipped another deity. And the question you ask is, why? Why Cyrus? What was in this man that God saw before he was even born? The answer may lie in Cyrus's own character. While the Assyrians impaled prisoners and the Babylonians deported entire nations, Cyrus ruled with a principle radical for the time: tolerance. The Cyrus cylinder declares that he restored temples of various gods, allowed deported peoples to return to their lands, and prohibited forced labor. He did not impose his religion. He did not destroy cultures. He did not burn conquered cities. In a world where conquest meant annihilation, Cyrus conquered and preserved, and perhaps that was exactly what God saw in him. Not faith, but justice. Not devotion, but mercy. But Cyrus was just the beginning. The empire he built would last 200 years and produce kings who would appear in the most dramatic pages of the Bible. And what happened inside the Persian palaces after Cyrus will shock you, because it involves a Jewish queen, a planned genocide, and a twist so improbable it seems like a movie script. Except it isn't fiction. It is recorded in the book of Esther. But before we get to Esther, I need to tell you what happened behind the scenes of the empire after Cyrus died. Because between the decree of liberation and the book of Esther, there is a turbulent period that almost destroyed everything Cyrus built and almost prevented the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus died in 530 BC, fighting against the Massagetae, a confederation of nomadic tribes in Central Asia. Herodotus says that the queen of the Massagetae, Tomyris, dipped Cyrus's decapitated head in a skin filled with blood and said, "You had a thirst for blood your whole life. Now drink." We don't know if this scene is real or symbolic, but we know that Cyrus died in combat, far from home, and that the throne passed to his son Cambyses II. And Cambyses was everything Cyrus was not. Paranoid, unstable, violent. He conquered Egypt in 525 BC, but his reign was marked by cruelty and chaos. He killed his own brother Bardia to eliminate rivals. And when he died, possibly by suicide, in 522, the empire plunged into a civil war with simultaneous rebellions in 19 provinces. It was in this power vacuum that Darius I emerged. a Persian noble from the Achaemenid lineage who took the throne by force, crushed all rebellions in less than 2 years, and then recorded his victories in the Behistun inscription, a gigantic relief carved 300 feet high on a cliff in western Iran in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This inscription, discovered in 1835 by the Briton Henry Rawlinson, was to cuneiform writing what the Rosetta Stone was to hieroglyphs. It deciphered an entire world. But for biblical history, Darius the Fair is fundamental for another reason. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem under Cyrus's decree, they began to rebuild the temple. But the local peoples, Samaritans, provincial governors, groups that had settled in the land during the exile, began to sabotage the work. Ezra chapter 4 describes how they sent letters to the Persian government accusing the Jews of sedition, saying they were rebuilding walls to rebel. The construction stopped. For almost 15 years, the temple's foundation sat abandoned, exposed to the sun and rain, like an unfinished monument to frustrated hope. And then the prophets Haggai and Zechariah raised their voices. Haggai 1:4. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? The people were ashamed. They restarted the work. And when the local governors protested again, Darius did something remarkable. He ordered a search of the royal archives and found Cyrus's original decree. Ezra 6 records Darius's response. He not only confirmed the decree, but ordered that the costs be paid in full by the royal treasury, and that anyone who interfered with the construction have their house turned into a dunghill. The temple was finally completed in 516 BC, and it was a Persian king who guaranteed it. Now, Daniel. Because Daniel lived under Persian rule and starred in one of the best-known scenes in the entire Bible in territory that is now Iran. Daniel chapter 6. Darius organized his empire into 120 provinces, each ruled by a satrap, and above them 3 supervisors. Daniel was one of those 3, a deported Jew, now over 80 years old, holding one of the highest positions in the world's largest empire, and the other officials hated it. A foreigner, a captive, a worshipper of a god no one knew, sitting above pure-blooded Persian and Median nobles. So they set a trap. They convinced Darius to sign a decree forbidding any prayer to any god or man other than the king himself for 30 days. The punishment, the lion's den. Daniel knew of the decree, and the text says something that reveals everything about this man. He went home, opened the windows that faced toward Jerusalem, a city he had not seen in over 60 years, and prayed on his knees 3 times a day, exactly as he had always done. He did not hide, he did not negotiate, he did not adapt his faith to the imperial decree. And when they took him to the den and threw him among the lions, Darius, the man who signed the sentence, spent the whole night without sleep, without eating, without music. The king of the greatest empire on earth lost sleep because of a Jewish prisoner. In the morning, he ran to the den and cried out with an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to deliver you from the lions?" And from the depths of that darkness that smelled of old blood and animal fur came the answer, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. Daniel came out without a scratch, and Darius issued a decree ordering the entire empire to fear the God of Daniel. This happened in Iran, in the Persian capital, in the heart of imperial power. 30 years passed. Darius died, and the throne passed to a man whom the Greeks knew as Xerxes and whom the Bible calls Ahasuerus. And here enters the most improbable story of the Old Testament. Xerxes ruled from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. His palace in Susa, excavated by French archaeologists, revealed exactly what the Book of Esther describes. Marble columns, white and violet curtains fastened by cords of linen and purple to silver rings, couches of gold and silver on a pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Esther 1:6 describes this with a precision that only makes sense if the author knew the palace personally. Xerxes began his reign with a 180-day banquet. 6 months of celebration to display the wealth of the empire to all his nobles and governors. At the end, he organized another 7 days of feasting for the people of the citadel of Susa, and on the 7th day, drunk, he sent for Queen Vashti to display her beauty before the guests. Vashti refused. In a culture where the king's word was absolute law, a woman said no. Xerxes was furious. His advisors panicked, not because of Vashti, but because of the precedent. If the queen can disobey, every wife in the empire will think she can do the same. Vashti was deposed, and an imperial search began to find a new queen. Esther was a young Jewish girl, an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai in the neighborhoods of Susa. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, which means myrtle, a discreet plant that blooms in silence. Mordecai instructed her to hide her Jewish identity. No one in the palace knew, and when Esther was taken along with hundreds of other young women to the royal harem, she went through 12 months of preparation, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And when she was finally presented to Xerxes, the text says simply, "The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won grace and favor in his sight. The crown was placed on her head." A Jewish girl was now queen of the largest empire in the world, and no one knew, but Esther did not become queen to live in luxury. She was placed there to prevent an extermination, because shortly after her coronation, a man named Haman, an Agagite, a descendant of Israel's ancestral enemies, ascended to the position of prime minister. And Haman hated Mordecai. He hated him because Mordecai refused to bow down before him. All the palace servants prostrated themselves when Haman passed. Mordecai remained standing, and the text does not fully explain why, but Jewish tradition suggests that prostrating before Haman would be an act of idolatry that Mordecai could not accept. Haman did not just want to kill Mordecai. He wanted to exterminate all the Jews in the empire, all of them, from every province, every city, every village, from India to Ethiopia. He went to Xerxes and said, without mentioning the Jews by name, that there was a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. He offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver to the royal treasury to finance the operation. 10,000 talents. Herodotus records that the total annual revenue of the Persian Empire was about 14,560 talents. Haman was offering almost 70% of the annual budget of an empire to finance a genocide. Where did this money come from? The text does not say, but the volume suggests that Haman had already calculated how much he would profit by confiscating the properties of the dead Jews. This was not blind hatred, it was hatred with a spreadsheet. Xerxes agreed. He handed his signet ring to Haman, which was equivalent to giving total power of attorney to act in the king's name. The date of the massacre was chosen by lot, Pur in Persian, from which comes the name of the Feast of Purim, the 13th day of the month of Adar. Sealed letters were sent by royal couriers to all 127 provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children in one day, and to plunder their goods. When the news spread, Susa was in consternation, and Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city with a bitter cry. It is at this moment that Mordecai sends Esther the heaviest message of the book. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This phrase, for such a time as this, became one of the most cited in the entire Bible, because it contains an entire theology in one question. Mordecai is saying, perhaps the entire path that brought you here, the orphanhood, the beauty, the selection, the crown, was preparation for this moment. Not coincidence, purpose. Esther responded with an instruction that shows she was no longer a passive girl. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. That last phrase, if I perish, I perish. She knew that entering the king's presence without being called was punishable by death. The law made no exception even for the queen. The only path to the survival of her people passed through her accepting the possibility of her own death. What followed was a sequence of events so perfectly linked that chance cannot explain it. Esther entered the throne room. The king extended the golden scepter. She would live. She invited Xerxes and Haman to a banquet, then to another banquet. Meanwhile, that same night between the two dinners, Xerxes could not sleep. He asked the chronicles of the kingdom to be read to him, and by chance they opened exactly to the page that told how Mordecai had discovered and reported an assassination plot against the king, a service that had never been rewarded. The next morning, Xerxes asked Haman what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman, convinced the king was talking about him, suggested the most pompous treatment possible: royal robes, the king's horse, a parade through the city with a noble proclaiming his honor. And Xerxes said, "Do so to Mordecai the Jew." The text does not describe Haman's expression at that moment. It doesn't need to. The entire architecture of his ambition collapsed in one sentence. And at the second banquet, when Xerxes asked Esther what her request was, she finally revealed everything. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." Xerxes asked, furious, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther pointed, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Haman was hanged on the very same 75-foot gallows he had ordered built for Mordecai. The irony is so precise, it seems like literature, and it is. But it is also history. The decree of extermination could not be revoked, because the law of the Medes and Persians was irrevocable. So Xerxes authorized a second decree: the Jews could defend themselves. On the 13th of Adar, instead of being massacred, the Jews rose up and defeated their enemies in all 127 provinces. Esther records that they killed 75,000 attackers, but they did not touch the plunder. They did not loot. They did not steal. They fought for survival, not for profit. And to this day, more than 2,500 years later, Jews celebrate this liberation at the Feast of Purim, a Persian name for a Jewish feast commemorating an event that happened in Iran. Do you see the pattern? Persia is not a secondary setting in the Bible. It is the stage for some of its most decisive scenes. Cyrus freed the people. Darius rebuilt the temple. The court of Xerxes almost destroyed the Jews and then saved them. Each generation of the Persian Empire crossed paths with Israel's destiny in a different way. And we are not finished yet, because after Xerxes came another king who would change Jerusalem forever. Artaxerxes I ascended the throne in 465 BC after Xerxes was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. And it is under Artaxerxes that two of the most important characters of the post-exilic period enter the scene: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was a priest and scribe, a man whom the biblical text says had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules. In 458 BC, Artaxerxes authorized Ezra to return to Jerusalem with a second wave of returnees, carrying silver, gold, and voluntary offerings. Ezra records the letter from the Persian king ordering all the treasurers of the province beyond the river to give Ezra everything he asked for, up to 100 talents of silver, 100 cors of wheat, 100 baths of wine, and 100 baths of oil. A pagan king financing the religious restoration of Israel. But the most impactful mission came 13 years later in 445 BC, when Neemias, a Jew who served as the king's cupbearer, a position of extreme trust that meant tasting the wine before the king drank, received devastating news from Jerusalem. The city walls remained in ruins, the gates had been burned, the people lived in shame and vulnerability, without defense against any enemy who wanted to attack. Nehemiah wept, he fasted. And then he did something that required absurd courage. He asked the king for permission to rebuild the walls of the city his ancestors had ruled. Artaxerxes not only granted it, he gave letters of authorization, a military escort, and orders for the keeper of the king's forest to provide timber for the beams of the gates. And it is here that Nehemiah did something that modern engineers still study. When he arrived in Jerusalem and saw the extent of the destruction, he organized the reconstruction as a military project. He divided the wall into sections. Each family, each clan, each professional group was responsible for a stretch. The goldsmiths rebuilt next to the perfumers, the priests next to the merchants, and when Sanballat and Tobiah, local governors who did not want a strong Jerusalem, began to threaten and ridicule the work, Nehemiah armed the workers. Nehemiah describes the scene. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction, and with the other held a weapon. Masons with swords, builders with spears, and the wall was completed in 52 days. 52 days to rebuild the walls of an entire city. Nehemiah 6:16 says that when Israel's enemies heard of it, their confidence fell greatly, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. All of this, every stone replaced, every beam fitted, every gate restored, happened under the authorization and protection of the Persian Empire. Without Persia, there would be no Second Temple. Without Persia, there would be no walls in Jerusalem. Without Persia, Judaism as an organized religion might have disappeared in the canals of Babylon. And without Judaism, there would be no Christianity. There would be no Bible. The causal chain is dizzying. A Persian emperor who worshipped fire allowed the God of Israel to continue being worshipped, and this changed the religious trajectory of all human civilization. But the Persian Empire would not last forever, and biblical prophecy knew that too. Daniel chapter 8 describes a vision Daniel had while still in the Babylonian period. A ram with two horns, one larger than the other, which pushed westward, northward, and southward, and no animal could resist him. The angel Gabriel explains the vision directly. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The larger horn that grew later represents Persia dominating Media, exactly what happened historically. And then, in the vision, a male goat comes from the west with such speed that its feet do not touch the ground. It has a conspicuous horn between its eyes. It attacks the ram with violent fury, breaks its two horns, and tramples it. Gabriel interprets the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king, Alexander. That is the name. The first king of Greece, the great horn between the goat's eyes. In 334 BC, Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont with about 47,000 soldiers and entered Asia. He was 22 years old, and he had a fury that the ancient world had never seen. Daniel's description is surgical. The goat comes from the west with such speed that its feet do not touch the ground. And that is exactly how historians describe Alexander's campaigns. Impossible speed. He did not march, he flew over the map. The Persian Empire that Alexander encountered was no longer that of Cyrus or Darius I. It was that of Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, a man who inherited the throne by elimination, after poisonings and intrigues cut the line of succession above him. Darius III was not incompetent, but he ruled an empire that was already tired of itself. Rebellious satrapies, treasuries drained by decades of failed campaigns against the Greeks, a court where loyalty was bought and not earned. Alexander won the first major battle at Issus on the coast of present-day Turkey in 333. Darius fled so fast that he left behind his mother, his wife, and his daughters. Alexander treated them with honor, a calculated gesture that echoed throughout the empire. The message was clear. The Macedonian was more noble than the Persian king himself. But it was at Gaugamela in 331 BC, in what is now northern Iraq, that it all ended. Darius gathered what historians estimate to be between 50,000 and 100,000 soldiers. The exact number is disputed because Greek sources inflated the Persian numbers to glorify the victory. Alexander had about 47,000, and even so, he attacked straight into the center of the Persian line, aiming for Darius personally. When the Macedonian cavalry broke the formation and Alexander advanced toward the king, Darius did exactly what he had done at Issus. He fled, and this time the flight cost everything. The Persian army collapsed. The satrapies began to surrender one by one. Alexander entered Babylon without resistance. He entered Susa, the same palace of Esther, the same throne room where Xerxes had extended the scepter, and took the royal treasury, 40,000 talents of silver and gold. And then he marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the symbolic heart of the Achaemenid Empire, the place where Persian kings received tribute from all the nations of the earth at the New Year festival. Alexander looted Persepolis. He took 120,000 talents from the treasury, a wealth so absurd that it required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport it, according to Plutarch. And then he burned the palace. The ruins of Persepolis that tourists visit today still carry the marks of Alexander's fire. Blackened columns, stone cracked by the heat, a 200-year-old civilization reduced to ashes in one night. Historians debate whether the fire was planned as revenge for Xerxes' looting of Athens in 480, or if it was an accident from a wine-fueled party. It was probably both. Darius III was murdered by his own men while fleeing to the east. His cousin Bessus stabbed him and left him agonizing in a wagon on the edge of a dusty road. When Alexander's soldiers found the body, they say Alexander himself covered the corpse with his cloak. The last king of Persia died as a fugitive, betrayed by those who swore to protect him. And here, Daniel chapter 8 becomes frightening in its precision. Verse 8, the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Alexander died in 323 BC in Babylon at 32 years old, at his greatest strength, at his peak, without being defeated in a single battle. Fever, probably typhoid or malaria, aggravated by years of war wounds and brutal alcohol consumption. When his generals asked to whom he was leaving the empire, tradition says he replied, "To the strongest." And the next verse of Daniel says, "And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." Alexander's empire was divided among 4 of his generals. Cassander got Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus got Thrace and Asia Minor. Ptolemy got Egypt. And Seleucus got Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia, the largest portion, the heart of the old empire. And it is this division that will place Israel back at the center of the hurricane. Because the land of Israel was squeezed exactly between 2 of these kingdoms, the Ptolemaic Egypt to the south and the Seleucid Syria to the north. For more than a century, the Ptolemies controlled Jerusalem. It was a relatively tolerant period. The Jews maintained their traditions, their temple, their law. It was during this period that the Torah was translated into Greek, the famous Septuagint, because the Jewish community in Alexandria no longer spoke Hebrew in their daily lives. But in 198 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium in what is now northern Israel near Caesarea Philippi, where centuries later Jesus would ask his disciples who they said he was. And Jerusalem changed hands. The Seleucids took control. And for a time all seemed well. Antiochus III granted privileges to the Jews, respected the temple, and reduced taxes. But his son would change everything. Antiochus IV ascended the throne in 175 BC and adopted the title Epiphanes, God manifest, and Daniel describes him with precision. Chapter 8, verse 9, "Out of one of the four horns came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward glorious land." The glorious land is Israel. It always is. Antiochus Epiphanes did not just want to rule the Jews. He wanted to Hellenize them. He wanted them to abandon their law, their customs, their identity. And there were Jews who agreed, a priestly elite in Jerusalem who saw Greek culture as progress and the Torah as backwardness. The division was not just political, it was civilizational. What does it mean to be a Jew? The law of Moses or the philosophy of Aristotle? The temple or the gymnasium? Circumcision or the Olympic Games? And when the Hellenizing faction bought the high priesthood from Antiochus, literally bought it, paying tribute in exchange for the most sacred office in Judaism, the tension exploded. In 167 BC, Antiochus invaded Jerusalem. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees describe the horror. He forbade the observance of the Sabbath. He forbade circumcision. Mothers who circumcised their children were executed with the babies hung around their necks. Copies of the Torah were burned. And on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, Antiochus committed the most traumatic act in the history of the Second Temple before its final destruction. He erected an altar to Olympian Zeus over the altar of burnt offerings, and he sacrificed a pig in the Temple of Jerusalem. Daniel calls this the abomination of desolation. This expression would echo centuries later when Jesus, sitting on the Mount of Olives, looked at that same temple and told the disciples, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Jesus knew Daniel. Jesus knew that what Antiochus did was a pattern, a rehearsal for what was to come. But in 167, the response came from a place no one expected. Not from Jerusalem, not from a general, not from a king, from a village called Modin in the hills northwest of Jerusalem, where an elderly priest named Mattathias refused to sacrifice on a pagan altar. When a Hellenized Jew stepped forward to perform the sacrifice in his place, Mattathias killed him. He also killed the Seleucid official, and he fled to the mountains with his 5 sons. The Maccabean revolt had begun. Mattathias's third son, Judas, received the nickname Maccabeus, the hammer, and the name was perfect. Judas Maccabeus was a tactical genius who defeated much larger Seleucid armies using the mountainous terrain of Judea, ambushes, and a ferocity fueled by the conviction that he fought for God himself. In December 164 BC, 3 years to the day after the profanation, Judas reconquered Jerusalem. And when the priests entered the temple, they found the altar profaned, weeds growing in the courts, the gates burned. They cleaned everything, they built a new altar. And on the 25th of Kislev, they relit the menorah. Jewish tradition says there was enough oil for only 1 day, but the flame lasted 8 days. This is Hanukkah, the festival of lights, a celebration that exists this day because of events that happened under the shadow of an empire that inherited Persia. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22, Jesus was in Jerusalem during the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. He was walking in the portico of Solomon when the Jewish leaders surrounded him and asked, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus at Hanukkah, in the temple that the Maccabees restored, at the feast that celebrates victory over profanation. The Bible never wastes a setting. But let's go back to Persia. Because while the Maccabees fought and then their descendants, the Hasmoneans, ruled an independent Judea for nearly a century, the territory of the old Persian Empire did not stay Greek forever. The Seleucids were losing territory piece by piece, and from the east, from the Iranian plateau, a new power emerged: the Parthians. The Parthians were Iranians. They spoke an Iranian language. They worshipped the ancient Iranian gods. And throughout the 2nd century BC, they reconquered everything Alexander had taken: Mesopotamia, Media, Persia proper. Around 140 BC, the Parthian king Mithridates, "I ruled an empire that went from the Euphrates to Afghanistan." Persia had returned, under another name, with another dynasty, but with the same essence. An Iranian empire controlling the heart of the ancient world, and it was the Parthian Empire that became the great rival of Rome. Not the Germans, not the Celts, not Egypt, the Parthians. When the Roman general Crassus invaded Parthian territory in 53 BC, convinced he would crush those eastern barbarians with ease, the Parthian horse archers destroyed 7 Roman legions at the Battle of Carrhae. 20,000 Romans dead, 10,000 captured. The legionary eagles, the sacred symbol of Rome, taken as a trophy. It was the worst Roman defeat since Hannibal. And it is in this context, the Parthian Empire controlling everything east of the Euphrates, Rome controlling everything west, that Jesus was born. And here, the connection with Iran reaches the most extraordinary point of this entire journey. Matthew chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Wise men. In Greek, magoi. Where does this word come from? From Old Persian, magu. The Magi were the priestly caste of Persia, the same Magi who advised the Achaemenid kings, the same ones who interpreted dreams, read the stars, and maintained the sacred fire in the temples of Ahura Mazda. When Matthew says that Magi came from the east, he is saying that Persian priests, probably from the Parthian Empire, traveled hundreds of miles to worship a Jewish baby in an insignificant village in Judea. And they brought gifts that were not random. Gold, a gift for a king. Frankincense, a gift for a priest. Myrrh, used in embalming, a gift that pointed to death, kingship, priesthood, and sacrifice. The Persians understood who that child was before the leaders of Israel themselves did. Think of the geopolitical weight of this scene. The Parthian Empire was the mortal enemy of Rome. Herod ruled Judea as a vassal of Rome. And suddenly, a delegation of priests from the rival empire appears in Jerusalem asking, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Matthew says that when Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Of course he was. That was not just a religious visit, it was a diplomatic incident. Representatives of the rival power recognizing a king that Herod had not authorized. And Herod's reaction was what any paranoid tyrant would have. He tried to locate the child to eliminate him. When the Magi did not return to report, he massacred all the boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old or younger. The connection between Persia and biblical history, which began with Cyrus freeing the Jews, culminates here, with Persian priests kneeling before a newborn that the world did not yet know would change everything. From the Old to the New Testament, from the 1st chapter of Ezra to the 2nd chapter of Matthew, Persia is present. Not as a bystander, as an active participant in the most decisive moments of the narrative. And history did not stop there. because Christianity did not spread only to the west, to Rome, to Greece, to Europe. It also went to the east, into the Parthian Empire, and later into the Sassanid Empire, the last great Persian dynasty before Islam. The Church of the East, as it became known, established Christian communities in territories that are now Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and eventually reached as far as China and India. At the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon in 410 AD, the Church of the East already had an organized structure with bishops, dioceses, and a patriarch, all of this within the Sassanid Empire, a Zoroastrian empire that alternated between tolerating and persecuting Christians depending on who was on the throne and how relations with Rome were going. Because that was the problem. Rome had become Christian under Constantine. And the Sassanids looked at the Christians in their territory and thought, are these people loyal to us or to the Christian emperor across the border? The same suspicion the Jews faced centuries earlier, a people with divided loyalty. And even so, Christianity survived in Persia. It grew. It sent missionaries along the Silk Road. It translated the scriptures into Syriac, into Sogdian, into Pahlavi. The Nestorian stele of Xi'an, erected in 781 AD in the capital of Imperial China, records in Chinese and Syriac the arrival of Christianity in the Tang Empire. Persian missionaries, coming from Iran, carrying the gospel not to Rome, not to Constantinople, but to Chang'an, the largest city in the world at that moment. The church that was born in Jerusalem spoke Persian on the plateaus of Iran and Chinese in the palaces of the Tang dynasty. And then came Islam in 636 AD at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in the desert of southern Iraq. An Arab Muslim army under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas faced the Sassanid army of General Rostam Farrokhzad. The Sassanids had war elephants. They had the military tradition of 1,000 years of Iranian empires. They had numerical superiority, and they lost. Rostam died in combat, and with him died the last great Persian army. In 651, the last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, and notice the pattern. Another last king, another fugitive, was murdered in Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan. A miller killed him for his clothes. The empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus, which challenged Rome for 400 years, ended with a king stabbed by a peasant who wanted his jewelry. Persia became Muslim, but, and this is fundamental, it did not become Arab. The Persian language survived. It adapted the Arabic alphabet, absorbed Arabic vocabulary, but kept its grammar, its poetry, its soul. 300 years after the conquest, when almost everyone assumed that Persian identity had been dissolved into the caliphate, a poet named Ferdowsi completed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. 60,000 verses in deliberately pure Persian, telling the mythical and real history of Iranian kings from the creation of the world to the Sassanid fall. Ferdowsi took 30 years to write it, and he said, with the same awareness Daniel had when writing his visions, "I suffered for these 30 years, but I revived Iran with the Persian language." And he did revive it. The Iran of today is a country of 88 million people, an Islamic theocracy since the 1979 revolution, one of the most complex geopolitical actors in the modern Middle East. But beneath the political surface, Persian identity pulses with the same strength of 3 millennia. On Nowruz, the Persian New Year, celebrated at the spring equinox, Iranian families set the Haft-Sin table with 7 symbolic items that start with the letter S in Persian. It is a Zoroastrian tradition, pre-Islamic, more than 2,500 years old, and 88 million people celebrate it as if Cyrus were still on the throne. The Cyrus cylinder, that same declaration of rights in baked clay, is to this day an Iranian national symbol. A replica sits in the United Nations building in New York. Another is in the National Museum of Tehran. The founder of the empire that freed the Jews is still a source of pride for a people who passed through Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, and revolutions, and never stopped being Persian. And the Bible recorded all of this, not as a footnote, as leadership. Cyrus is the liberator anointed by God he did not know. Darius is the builder who financed the Second Temple. Xerxes is the setting for the drama that saved an entire people from extermination. Daniel rules under Persian kings and receives visions that map the future with surgical precision. The Persian Magi are the first Gentiles to recognize the Messiah. And the Church of the East carries the gospel along the paths that the Persian empires paved, from Ctesiphon to Chang'an, from Susa to Kerala. If there is a lesson in this story, a lesson that crosses Cyrus, Esther, Daniel, Alexander, the Maccabees, the Magi, and modern Iran, it is this. The empires the Bible describes are not metaphors. They are real. Their ruins are there. Their decrees were found in baked clay under mounds of sand. Their kings have faces carved into rock walls that you can visit today. And the God the Bible describes moving through these nations, using a pagan king as his anointed, protecting a Jewish queen in the harem of an emperor, shutting the mouths of lions in a Babylonian den, guiding foreign priests by a star to a manger. This God operates on a scale that no human screenwriter would invent, because no screenwriter would connect a prophecy written in exile to Persian priests kneeling before a newborn carpenter in Bethlehem, separated by 5 centuries and thousands of miles, and make it all verifiable history. Iran is not what the headlines say it is. It is older, it is deeper, it is more biblical than most people ever imagined. It is one of the longest threads in the fabric the scriptures weave, a thread that begins with a decree of liberation engraved in clay and ends with Magi following a star over the desert. And between those 2 points is the proof that biblical history did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the real world, in our world, in the same mountains, the same rivers, the same roads that exist today. And the consequences of these events are still unfolding, in every synagogue that exists because the temple was rebuilt, in every church that exists because the gospel traveled east, in every page of the Bible that you can open tonight and read under the same moon that illuminated Cyrus when he entered Babylon without shedding a single drop of blood. If you have made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen. I have set it aside specifically for those who watched this one until the end.